Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Rabbi.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, Rabbi.
Good morning to you.
That's recorded.
Yeah. Good morning to you. We're learning Mishnah Shabbos, starting Perek at Aleph, chapter 11, Mishnah Aleph, Mishnah 1. Okay. Continuing the discussion about the malacha of haitzah, of transferring. So Hazorik, somebody who throws something, Rishus hayachal Rishus harabim, from a private domain to a public domain, meaning let's call it a public thoroughfare. Rishus harabim Rishus hayachid, or he throws something from a public domain, a public thoroughfare, to a private domain, is chayev, is liable. That means that although until now, when we spoke about transferring, the typical case for transferring would be that somebody picks up something from his house and takes it outside to the public domain and puts it down there. Or somebody picks up something from the public domain, brings it into his house and puts it down there. That would be your, classical haitzah. And as we mentioned previously, all the 39 avos malachas, all the 39 primary forms of forbidden labor on Shabbos were all found in the construction of the Mishkan. Mm-hmm. And the way that, the way haitzah, the way transferring manifested itself in the construction of the Mishkan was that the Mishkan itself, again, was a walled-in area. That, of course, inside was a private domain. But the walls of the Mishkan were located in a public area, a very public area. So let's say the Mishkan had to be taken down because they were traveling. So what would happen is the Levium who did this work, they would pick up the beams that were in a public domain and put them onto wagons. And the wagons themselves had walls so that they were considered a private domain. And then when the Mishkan had to be constructed, they took the beams from the wagon and then brought them to the public area to erect the Mishkan. This is something they had to do every time they traveled. Wasn't this was something they had to do when they traveled. Traveling from place to place, they had to take apart the Mishkan, build it again. So therefore, this is how haitzah transferring, manifested itself in the construction of the Mishkan. They weren't throwing things necessarily. They weren't taking these beams and throwing them. But throwing is similar enough to transferring. Mm-hmm. It's a tolda. It's a secondary form. It's similar enough to the primary form to say that it's also going to be forbidden according to Torah law, because when you throw something, you pick it up, let's say from the private domain, you throw it, and it lands in the public domain. That also falls under the malach of haitzah. So that's what the Mishnah said. When you throw from a private domain to a public domain, or from a public domain to a private domain, you are liable. Now, just for what we said previously, a private domain is an area that is 4 by 4 tefachim. Tefachim is a handbreadth, let's call it between 3 and 4 inches. An area 4 by 4 that is surrounded by 4 walls is a private domain. A private domain can also be an alleyway. That alleyway means you have different courtyards that lead into this alleyway that you walk through it to get to the public domain. If it has 3 walls, and then on the 4th side, either a pole or a crossbeam, that also makes it a private domain. That's a private domain. A public domain is an area that is, again, it's public. Mm-hmm. It is. Let me just see how this. Want to make sure I get all the. Okay, Rishus Harabim are public thoroughfares, and they have to be wide 16 amas. It has to be 16 cubits wide, which is anywhere between like 1.5 and 2 feet. Okay, it cannot have a ceiling. It has to be open air. And some say you need 600,000 people per day going through. Mm-hmm. Now, if you think about it, right, there are places like that in this in this country. How many people drive through the Mass Pike every day?
Yeah,
it's a lot of people. It's a lot of people going through. Yeah. So again, and again, that's not everybody's opinion. That's the accepted opinion. Yeah. But that's what it takes to be a public domain. It's got to be an area that's used by the public regularly. Okay. So we say if you throw from private domain to public domain to private domain, you're going to be liable. We also remember we had something called a Carmelis. A Carmelis was an area kind of in between. It's not a Rosh Hashanah, it's not a Rosh Hashanah, according to Torah law. That was an area that was 4 by 4, 3 tvachim off the ground, but less than 10 tvachim high, up to 10 tvachim high. That is a Carmelis. That is an area that midrabanan, according to rabbinic law, you have to treat it both like a private domain and a public domain in regard to the other one. Meaning you don't, according to Torah, according to rabbinic law, you cannot go from a private domain to a Carmelis, almost like call it out of your house into the street, where the street is not a public domain because it's not that used or wide or big. Or from the outside into your house, which would be a Carmelis, into your private domain. And then we have something called a Makim P'tur, that it's not even 4 by 4. If it's not even 4 by 4, it's called a Makim P'tur. And even according to rabbinic law, you can move things to there or things from there to a private or public domain. Now, next case. Merishus Hayachad, Rishus Hayachad. He threw something from a private domain. I mean, he picked it up in the private domain. He threw it. It landed in a private domain. Or Rishus Harabim be'emtza. But the Rishus Harabim was in the middle. So just for the sake, this picture, really, they have it for the next Mishnah. If you take a look at this picture, right? So you've got the houses on each side of the street, they're private domains. You're throwing from house to house, but it's going over the public domain. Okay. Now you'll notice that in this picture, the areas are quite low off the ground. And there's a reason for that. Because Rishus Harabim, the area of Rishus Harabim only goes up to 10 tvachim.
Oh, okay.
Meaning your feet are within the 10 tvachim, you're walking there, right? And when you transfer, we're now going to transfer something 4 tvachim Rishus Harabim. Right?
Right.
Now, you may be holding it above 10 tvachim, but you're in the 10 tvachim, right? But if you were to go ahead and throw it higher than 10 tvachim, I didn't even read the Mishnah yet, but the Mishnah says, then you go from a private domain through a public domain to a private domain. But let's say, and wherever the halacha is going to be by this Mishnah, the case is that you threw it low enough, right? Meaning in this case, the balconies are very low, and therefore it's going through the public domain, but it's going from private domain to private domain, but within 10 tvachim off the ground. So that means it went through the public domain. Where these balconies to be higher, and you're throwing it above, above 10 tvachim with the Rishus Harabim, then you wouldn't be liable according to Torah law. So now let's read the Mishnah. Let's read the Mishnah. Rishus Hayachad, going from a private domain to a private domain, or Rishus Harabim be'emtza, and the Rishus Harabim is in the middle. Rabbi Akiva Machayev. Rabbi Akiva says you are liable for transferring on Shabbos. The Chachamim Paitrim and the Chachamim exempt. Now the obvious question here is it didn't land in Rishus Harabim. It just went through the Rishus Harabim. And we know that anytime you do any form of Haitzah has to be that it was picked up or uprooted from the private domain and then put down in the public domain or vice versa. It's got to have what's called a hanach. It's got to be put down. It's got to come to rest. But in this case, it didn't come to rest in the public domain. It just flew through. Rabbi Akiva still says you're chayiv because Rabbi Akiva holds of the following principle. In the Gemara terms, it's klut kamisho hincha. Something contained in the airspace of a domain is viewed as if it has come to rest in it. That's how they translate it here in the notes. And I'll read further. That is, when an object enters the airspace of a different domain, it is encompassed by that domain and caught in it. Therefore, it is legally regarded as having come to rest there. You enter a space, you're kind of you're taken in by, you're in the space, you're now taken in by the space. That's called it landed. That's as if it landed. And therefore, since the object passed through the public domain, and again, it passed through the public domain, right? It's within 10 tvachim off the ground. Rabbi Akiva says it's like it came to rest. The Chachamim say, no, it's not. They disagree with that principle. And therefore they say, Paitrin, if you did that, you'd be exempt from a Torah, you would not be liable for a Torah prohibition. But again, midrabanan, according to rabbinic law, you wouldn't be permitted to do it. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful Shabbos.
Shabbos.
I have a problem with this.
Last Shabbos.
Oh, thank you, Rabbi.